Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Service Automation webinar, which we're delivering with our partners at the Service Automation Framework Alliance. My name is Mark Constable. I'll be your host for the webinar, and I'm delighted to be joined by presenter Jan-Willem Middelberg. So Jan-Willem is the author of the Service Automation Framework, which was developed to provide deep insight into theory and methods of service automation. And in today's webinar, Jan-Willem will be focusing on service automation from the perspective of local government, and specifically how it's supporting them on their digital transformation journeys and the development of quality services for the citizens they serve. Before Jan-Willem gets into the detail, bear with me a few moments while I cover a few housekeeping points. So the first of those is the fact we're recording the session today, and everyone that's registered will receive a follow-up email from us soon after the webinar, as soon as the recording's available online. Secondly, you've got an opportunity to raise questions at any point throughout the webinar, so you should see an option on your control panel to submit questions, unless you've joined us on a mobile device. And last but not least, we welcome any feedback on the webinars, as that helps us with planning and delivering webinars in the future. Okay, that's all from me until we get to some questions. So I'll hand things over to Jan-Willem. Jan-Willem is joining us from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So it's good afternoon, Jan-Willem, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks again for having me on one of these webinars. I'm really excited to be presenting this webinar on service automation in local governments today, because it really brings together all the experience we have gathered working with local government organizations in the last 2 years. So what we will do today is that we will start with giving a bit of a basic understanding of what service automation is all about. Why is this term becoming so popular these days, and what is the service automation framework and how that was developed. After that, we will dive into the role of the local government as a service provider and how service automation can really fit that model in order to make services better, faster, and cheaper. And then we start with a bit of theory, and after that we dive into the actual case study. And I think that over time we've developed a very practical and hands-on implementation methodology on how you can automate government services. So we will run through that model and discuss each of those steps individually, and showcase also some examples of some of the work that we've done with local government organizations. After that, it's time to answer some questions, and I think, as Mark already mentioned, you can submit questions through the GoToWebinar panel and submit your questions there, and then we will answer them at the end of the webinar together in a sort of Q&A session. So without further introductions, let's just get started and dive into the topics themselves. Let's begin with the topic of why service automation has grown so rapidly in the last couple of years. And one of the main reasons is because all the companies that you see on the screen right now have turned out to be so tremendously successful. They're really the pioneers, the disruptors, and they have been growing very, very rapidly in the last decade. If you think a little bit deeper about what all of these organizations have in common, it's basically two things. First thing is that they are service providers. So each of these companies doesn't sell tangible products, they sell services, whether it's transportation services or hotel nights or insurance. All of these are classic examples of the domain of the service industry. The second key denominator is that each of these companies has found a way to deliver these services completely in an automated fashion. Ask yourself the following question: have you ever spoken to any of the people that work at any of these companies? The likely answer to that is probably going to be no, because they have automated every step of their service delivery model along the way. So when you're making a booking, when you're changing a booking, whether you want to receive more information, you're all going to go to the respective self-service portals of any of these organizations and figure out what the next steps are on those pages. So this is really an example to kind of get the understanding started of what service automation is. And because of the rapid growth of these kinds of companies, there's been a tremendous amount of interest in service automation from all different kinds of industries, including government organizations. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So let's start off with a very high-level definition of what service automation actually is. And if you break that down and you look at the official definition, service automation is obviously first and foremost the automated delivery of a service. So it means that you, where you normally would interact with a service provider into a number of one-on-one meetings or service interactions, the whole process of you consuming that service is now completely automated. And frequently that will go either through apps or online platforms with which you can interact on a day-to-day basis. That also means that the user or the consumer is always in charge. So the moment that you request a specific service, that is the moment that the service delivery process actually starts. And if you think about that a little bit more deeply, that is quite a different way of thinking, because how most service organizations, including lots of governments nowadays, think is, well, we are a service provider, we provide services to the outside world, and that is the way that we design them. With service automation, it's exactly the other way around. Every service only starts after a user initiates a service request. So you really need to have a completely different design model that always starts from the request of a specific user. And what we mean with that is something that we're going to explore a little bit in more detail in this webinar. The third key component, obviously, is the technology part. You cannot have any type of automation if you don't have technology to support that. So one of the other common elements of the definition of service automation is that there's always some sort of a self-service technology or platform available through which the service is actually delivered to end users. So each of these contributes to the definition of service automation, which brings me to the last element, and that is, if you do this process well, you make sure that your customers are so happy that they want to get back to you. And because you have all that data available, it is easier to continually improve that service experience over time. So in the last and final goal of service automation is not just to deliver a service once, but to make sure that users keep coming back and request for more services over time. And that's what we refer to when we talk about an optimal user experience. So this is basically a breakdown of the definition of service automation. So what does that mean for organizations and for businesses and even for governments in particular? Well, it means that if you think about what that can do, is that there's a number of key benefits that really are different from a traditional service delivery model. And they are listed on the slide here. So I'll quickly run through a number of these. And we'll start with the fact that service automation is highly, highly scalable. If you have an automated process, it really doesn't matter so much whether you service 1 or 5 or 10 or even 1,000 users at the same time. Because in the end, service automation is based upon scripts and workflows. So that makes these kinds of delivery models extremely scalable. And if you look back at the examples of the companies that we just discussed, this is also one of the key drivers of their growth. For them, it really doesn't matter to add another 100 users or another 1,000 users, because automation makes it so very scalable. The second and third key benefits are that if you use a service automation delivery model, it means that you can make data-driven decisions because you know exactly what your users are doing. And that also infers that it's very user-centric. So every decision, every click, every swipe, everything that a user does in one of those portals is monitored, tracked, and can therefore be improved over time. Fourth, and also of course very important in today's age, is that service automation also provides a cost efficiency model. A lot of time many organizations still spend on doing the same kinds of requests many times over. So if you automate a lot of those requests individually, you can get rid of unnecessary manual labor, and that is a huge advantage for any type of organization. And then last but not least, and I kind of already explained that a little bit, is that it provides a framework for exceeding those users' expectations in the long run. So moving on, what is then the service automation framework? Well, basically, this is the combined body of knowledge that a number of experts all across the globe put together in order to enhance automated services. What we found when we started a couple of these projects 7 or 8 years ago is that there really was not a good model available that explained how you can move from a traditional service delivery model towards an automated service delivery model. So based on a number of projects that we wrote down our experience, and that resulted in the model that you see on the slide. So today's webinar is unfortunately not long enough to dive into the details of each of these different components, but a very high-level overview of the service automation framework is depicted on the slide. And what you can see here is that the service automation framework consists of 6 main building blocks, we call them, which are the elements that you need to take into consideration when you're designing and developing automated services. So it starts obviously from the user, because as I mentioned before, every new service request is initiated by a user somewhere. So you really need to understand who your user is and what are their individual preferences. Then you move through a number of different steps from the design to technology and a number of processes such as deployment, delivery, and ultimately serendipity in order to get that automated service to market. So the service automation framework basically is nothing else than a how-to guide on how do you transform your traditional services into automated ones. And that has been launched in 2016 and has grown very rapidly ever since. And if we look at what service automation does, and the service automation framework in particular, I always use this slide to explain what you see on the left is a traditional service provider, and on the right you see an automated service delivery provider. In any traditional organization, there's a lot of interactions that constitute a service. So for instance, if you use an accounting service, you submit your figures, you get a reaction back, and you interact with your service provider a number of times. The same is true if you go for education. You have a number of interactions with your service provider, and that is what constitutes the service. What we do in service automation is we move the model on the left to the model on the right. So what we do is that we build what we call a self-service portal as a layer in between, and that is what we refer to as the self-service portal. So instead of interacting individually one-on-one between a user and a service provider, we now start to communicate through the self-service portal. And how this will work in local government is something that we're going to explore in the next couple of slides. So this is just a very high-level overview of what the service automation is and what it does. Key question then, of course, is, well, how does that relate to local governments? Because the model was traditionally used in a lot of IT service organizations, but what we've been seeing in the last 2 years specifically is that there is a lot of interest from especially government organizations. So a very good question to start with, well, if we look at the role of local governments anywhere across the world, I'm based in Asia, but it's no different here than anywhere else in Europe or North America. If we break down what local governments do and what their purpose and responsibilities are anywhere in any region, it's basically twofold. And if we break that down into 2 purposes, the first purpose is to represent and involve citizens to get the things that they need and to build and execute upon those. I frequently refer to this as the policy part. So this is really how do you translate long-term needs and requirements into something which is beneficial for society at large. However, if you look at the second part of the role of a local government, it has an administrative purpose. This is where a government needs to take care of supplying goods and services. And those can be very simple things like handing out parking permits to marriage licenses or registrations, but they can also be very, very complex things like appeals or regulations or city development plans towards the future. But the main point that I want to make with this slide is that that second objective, that second purpose of local government is one of the most important elements. And if you translate that back to automation, it means that any local government is basically in its core a service provider, because you get a lot of requests from citizens on a daily basis and you need to deal with those requests. And that is, I think, also the reason why service automation has grown so rapidly in this area. Let me explain a little bit further how this works. If we look at the role of local government as a service provider, we are dealing with citizens. So I depicted a citizen at the bottom of the slide. And basically, a citizen wants to arrange all kinds of stuff. He wants to, for instance, get a driver's license, or he wants to register his business, or he wants to have some waste picked up by a local government service. So there's all kinds of needs that are bestowed upon the government, all types of requests that need to be dealt with. And for that, a local government needs to provide a single point of contact for all its citizens. And that's what you see in the bar in the middle. Traditionally, that is a city hall or an administrative office where you can go in and you can request and arrange these kinds of things. Behind that first single point of contact, there are different other government agencies that are either working with the government or that are supporting that. So obviously there are higher forms of government, sometimes state legislation or federal governments that are important stakeholders. There might also be other different government departments that need to be involved. A very common example there is the IRS or the tax agencies that need to be involved in these kinds of discussions. But there can also be third-party providers available. So a lot of work that local governments do is outsourced in long-term contracts towards third-party providers. And there's also all kinds of arrangements with these providers. So of course it would not make any sense for a citizen to go to different stakeholders, to different parties on a day-to-day basis. It would be very confusing. So what a good local government should do is provide this single point of contact for all of its citizens. And then with that we mean for all of the stuff that a local government needs to provide. And if you look at the right of the slide, you see a number of very common elements that governments or local governments take care of, for instance, public services or education services or even animal services. All of these things need to be arranged as a primary task of local government. And what that means is it very quickly becomes quite complex. And if you count the number of service requests that are bestowed upon the local government on a daily basis, it very quickly goes into the thousands, if not tens of thousands per day. And no matter where your local government is located, these types of service requests are very, very similar. And because of that, it makes it possible to have a huge advantage in terms of efficiency in order to learn from previous processes and to do that smarter. So what we would like to do when we implement service automation for local government is that we like to put in that layer in the middle again. And if you look at this slide more closely, you see that it's very similar to the previous one, with the exception that there is now a single self-service portal in the middle, the layer in green. So very similar to the slides that I just showed, we're putting in a layer of automation. And that means that we make a portal available for citizens where they can arrange all their requests and services that they would like to have as a citizen. So what does that mean, and how can we make that practical? Because lots of different government organizations have already started with any type of with forms of this, but how do you combine all of that knowledge into a single point for all of your citizens that they can access? That's what we're going to be looking at next. So key question there is, of course, how do you achieve that? And what we've seen is that there's already a whole drive towards digitalization of local government services or local government offices. Some people call it service governments, some countries call it e-governments. A term that I've seen coming up lately is government as a platform, which is also used in the UK a lot. And basically all of these are different variations of the same theme. How can we make service delivery more easy, more accessible, cheaper and faster towards citizens? And I think that's the common denominator of the problem. I think everybody who works in local government will already be busy with one of these forms. They're not all called the same across the world, but they have all the same and common purpose. So how do you deal with that? And what we found when we did a bit more research on this is that a lot of people are really advocating for these types of transformations. We found that there is many policymakers that really see the benefit of automation and that are really pushing agendas towards digitalization of government services to citizens. And although there's a lot of information already available on that should happen, what we found in practice is that a lot of local governments really struggle with the question, well, if we know that needs to happen, how do we actually achieve it? And I think what the Service Automation Framework does very well is that it provides a very detailed and easy to use steps in which you can do these kinds of things yourself. How do you get started? How do you actually automate traditional services into a self-service model? And that's kind of what we wanted to share with you today, is how do you actually make this work? So what you see on the next slide is our 6-step approach. Basically, this is knowledge that we combine from different implementations across the world. What you will see in the next couple of slides is that we sometimes anonymize a couple of examples because of non-disclosure agreements. But basically, no matter whether the project were done in India or Kuala Lumpur or even the Netherlands, these are very similar steps that you can actually start taking in order to answer that how question. How do you automate services on a day-to-day basis? So I'm not just all going to read them out because we're going to look at these a little bit more in detail. But you see that it has a very clear flow from the beginning to the bottom. And I think that's what makes it a very simple and easy model to work with. So let's get started. First, and maybe most importantly, you need, as a local government, you need to start putting yourself into the shoes of your own citizens. You need to understand what is it that my citizens want and how can we as a government subsequently facilitate that. And what I've seen in most organizations, no matter whether it's government or corporates or any type of organization, is that services are very frequently defined from a provider point of view. And what I mean with that is that services are frequently specified as in the following way. We, as a service provider, arrange this in this particular manner. And that's what you see on the slide here as well, when we talk about what I refer to as a traditional service provider. So here's an example of parking permits, something every local government has to deal with, and a traditional service provider will frequently have a statement like, the city of XYZ is responsible for the distribution and renewal of parking permits for its residents. Which is, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a very valid statement, and it's something that every local government needs to deal with. However, it kind of fails to recognize what does need to happen then. How can we facilitate our citizens to do that by themselves? What is the action and the trigger point that sets off this process? Because remember, if you want to deliver automated services, the initiation point is always with a specific user, or in this case, citizen. So another way of looking at that is to start defining all of the services from a citizen point of view. So putting yourself into the shoes of the actual citizen itself. And if you would do that, you would look at the same kind of service in a different way. And that brings us to the second line on the slide. From a citizen-centric provider, the similar statement would be, well, as a citizen of, in this case, city A, B, or C, I would like to request and renew my parking permit and submit changes in case I buy a new car. Because that's actually what a citizen wants. That's what they hope to get out of it. They would like to have this point where they can arrange those kinds of requests. But very frequently, I find in a lot of discussions, I found that this is one thing that organizations struggle with the most. How do you find services from a user point of view? And with the service automation framework, I think this is a very easy way to get started. So that's step one. Then, after you've done the first exercise, you will very frequently or very quickly see that there are a lot of requests or services that are very similar, or that can be grouped into in a category. In the example I just gave about parking permits, there is for instance, a request for a new parking permit, but you can also think about the extension of an old one, or that you want to change the registration license of your car because you bought a new car. All of those are requests which are very, very similar and which can be grouped very easily together. So in step two, out of all the service requests that are bestowed upon your local government organization, you're going to define what we refer to as service catalogs. And a service catalog is nothing else than a collection of services that citizens can request on a day-to-day basis. Well, good question, and of course, is, well, why make these individual categories? Well, basically, there's two reasons to do this. The first one is very simple. Categorization gives clarity. So if people need to find the service that they're looking for, they start browsing by category. Asking, for instance, for business registration is something completely different than ask the government to pick up your trash. So that's the first reason. Categorization definitely gives clarity and makes things more simple. The second part is also has to do with the slide that I showed previously with the different government departments. What you frequently see in local government is that there are different functions or different departments in the government that are responsible for a specific set of services. So for instance, if you look at the slide here, you will have the Civil Affairs Office, which deals with all kinds of things like passports, driver's licenses, marriage documentation, etc. Very frequently, that is a completely different department than, for instance, the Education Department that deals with schools and certifications, etc., etc. So by categorizing every service into a specific service catalog, it also makes it very, very clear which department or which function of the government is ultimately responsible for doing this. So that's the second step. So first, you define the services. The second step is that you categorize and bundle these into different service catalogs. Up next is one of the central components of the service automation framework approach, and that is that you start blueprinting each of those services into a service automation blueprint. On the slide here, you see an example of how that is done for passport issuance and collection. Today, we don't have the time to dive into all of the elements of the service automation framework blueprinting approach very thoroughly, but if you're interested in that, there's a pretty good articles on the service automation website on how to do that. But I think you get the basic notes. What you do in an exercise like this is that you design a process flow and a workflow that ultimately constitutes that service. And if you look at the top of the slide, you see that there's a number of user actions. So that's on the user, or in this case, on the citizen side. All the way at the bottom, you see the different government departments that have to deal with these kinds of passport requests. So that's the provider side. And what you do in a design like this is that you very clearly outline, well, what are the responsibilities of a user, what kind of information does he or she needs to get, and how does the process flow all the way from the left to the right. So from the initial request for a new passport all the way to the delivery and handing out of a specific passport. And some processes will be very, very simple. For instance, to register your dog. But some processes are a little bit more complicated, such as, for instance, issuing these passports, which is a more complex process. But ultimately, what you would like to do if you deliver automated services is that everything needs to be scripted, everything needs to be automated. And from a technology point of view, that means that you need to put things into workflows and into scripts. So this approach really helps to clarify what the ultimate design will be of an automated service. And I think this is one of the most important steps out of the 6-step approach is, are you able to make these types of blueprints for every service that you deliver as a government organization? So after step 3, then you need to put it into practice. So with the design of all those workflows, you need to select a technology provider or a platform provider that is able to give you the tools to make those workflows accessible for everyone. So that's where you're designing and developing your self-service portal. On the slide, I put an example from the city of Amsterdam. That's where I'm originally from. So I thought they're always a very good example, and they do this fairly well. So if you're a citizen of the city of Amsterdam, which I've been for many, many years, there's this one centralized portal where you can arrange all the stuff that you want to arrange. And what you see right here is that they also already did a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good job in categorizing and bundling different types of government services. So for instance, here you see parking, you see waste and recycling, you see civil affairs, which are all very good examples of what we just discussed, which are service catalogs. So each of those different buttons will have different types of services underneath them that you can request. So this is a very good example, I think, of how you can translate the workflows that we devised in the previous step into something which works and is practical on a day-to-day basis. So that's step 4. Moving on, the next step, which is very frequently forgotten, is you need to then subsequently communicate that this portal exists. And although that sounds very, very simple, you really need to think about how do we make our people aware that they can actually use this. And what we've seen in a number of projects that I worked on is that this works very, very well, especially if you have government organizations that are not open 24/7 or 7 days a week. So in the beginning, people would still come into physical offices and move into to buildings. But as soon as they find out that there's also this portal available where they can arrange all this kind of stuff immediately and almost without any waiting times, that very frequently helps to get the awareness up. Other things and examples that you see on the slide here, you can also start branding campaigns, marketing campaigns. You can give your portal a very good or unique name so that everybody instantly starts to recognize what is your way of communicating with local government. So that's a very critical and essential step, because without actual active users, the portal is in the end not going to work. And then moving on to the last one, and this is kind of my favorite topic, and this talks about serendipity management. So before we dive into how that works for local government, let me explain a little bit about what this term means. Serendipity, if you look at a dictionary, and you see it on the slide here as well, is something good that you didn't expect beforehand. I think we're all familiar with these kinds of events. Somebody sends you a note about something that you really hadn't thought about before, or somebody appears and gives you a discount or a very good service experience without you even asking for it. Those are all examples of what we refer to as serendipity management, something good that you didn't expect. And if you, as a government organization, you move towards service automation, it becomes so much easier to make the life of your citizens also easier. Think about the following examples that I listed down on the slide. What if you would get an automated message and a reminder anytime that your driver's license is due to expire? In most countries and in most local governments today, this is still something which is your own responsibility. But if people are ordering their driver's licenses through a portal, you know exactly when the expiry date will be. So you can set off triggers to send people that type of information. Also, other things like if your neighbor has requested a moving license, then that will be communicated to the neighbor, so you know that you can park your car there for a day. Or another example, you receive if you requested waste disposal, that you can get an exact feed or timer of when it will actually be picked up. All of these things are fairly easy to accomplish from a technology point of view. There's all kinds of workflows already readily available to solve these kinds of problems. But where it goes wrong is that a lot of organizations or government agencies have not put this into the design of their services. And if they were to do that, that would really greatly enhance the overall service experience for any type of user or any type of citizen. So in order to recap a little bit on what I just explained to you is, well, what are, from our best practices and the projects that we've done, what are ways in which you can actually do service automation for a local government? And what we did in this webinar is that we briefly ran through the 6 steps that are necessary in order to move from a traditional service provider towards an automated service provider. If you have more interest in information about any of the topics that we discussed, if you have registered for this webinar, you will automatically receive a white paper from APMG in the next couple of weeks that explains each of these topics into more detail. I think that I have seen a number of questions popping up while we were presenting. So maybe, Mark, can I ask you to step and join in now to moderate some of these questions?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks, jan-willem. So first one we've got is, are there any technologies you can recommend for a good self-service portal?
Well, of course, that's a very good question. From a service automation framework perspective, we really try very hard to be vendor independent. So I'm not going to recommend any particular technologies, but the thing that I will say is that which technology you should select is highly dependent on which type of service you try to automate. There's very good providers out there in the world that already have a workflow technology embedded, that have user management embedded, that have the ability to host and manage different types of service catalogs. So those are, I think, would be some of the areas that I would look into when I would consider that. Great additional benefit, of course, for a government organization is that if you really want to start moving with this, you're likely to go through a public tender process. where a lot of vendors will showcase their capabilities over time.
Okay, thanks, jan-willem. Next question, is there a list available for universal local government services?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question as well, and I've been looking for this for years, and I've not found any definitive guide that explains all the government services that local government can provide. And if you ever find one, I'd be the first one to be interested in that. Because if you think about it, whether you're running a local government in, let's say, India or Amsterdam or Spain or in the USA, most local government services will be very, very similar. Of course, there's always going to be regional differences. But for instance, things like parking permits are very universal, I think. So I think that in that it's a real surprise that there's no one definitive guide available that outlines all of these government services. So if you find one, be the first in row to request a copy.
Okay, thanks, jan-willem. Interesting one here. How can elderly people still be supported with automated technology?
Oh, well, I think that's a very fair and good question that I didn't answer yet during the webinar. Is the whole purpose of service automation in local government is not to eliminate any type of walk-in services, or in order to make sure that people cannot go to City Hall anymore. The whole purpose of service automation is to make sure that a lot of repeatable requests that are very common and very low risk. For instance, renewing a driver's license, or parking permits, or waste management, or all the things that I just mentioned, that it becomes easier to do that. And I think as a government organization, you have a duty to also make sure that there's still an analog or manual process available for people that really need to have that. But I always say, if you're able to automate only, let's say, 30 or 40% of your day-to-day work, and you could do those kinds of deliveries automatically, that will save a huge amount of resources every single day. So very good question, but I think it's a hybrid model.
Okay, thanks, jan-willem. And the last question we have is one that I can probably answer. Actually, it's one about accessing the white paper that I think you've made reference to, and so we will send that out. We'll send an initial follow-up email for the webinar to confirm when the recording's online, but there's a little bit of design work to finish on the white paper, so we'll send a further email. So just look out for your emails, basically. So that's the last of our questions. jan-willem, is there anything else that you wanted to add at this stage?
No, I think everybody really. I hope everybody enjoyed this webinar. I know it's a short time to cover a lot of different topics. So if you're interested, don't hesitate to contact me. I think my contact details are here on the last slide. And thanks again, APMG, for hosting me today. And I hope you found this very useful, and I look forward to one of our next sessions.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So, okay, I think that's everything. So to close, as jan-willem said, I'd like to thank everyone very much for attending too. Do hope you found it valuable and informative session. And many thanks, of course, to you, jan-willem, for your insights and expertise today. So that brings us to a close. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Mark.